Moving on to Unit 5 now, which deals with a poem by Elizabeth Bishop. It is quite a complicated poem, so the questions are challenging. Question 22 asks us how the sandpiper regards the sea. Now, there are a couple of traps in the options. The main thing we need to understand is that the expression controlled panic in line 4 is not in relation to the sea at all. And that is something that will really throw you unless you grasp that distinction. So, does the sandpiper regard the sea as a threat? Panic is not about the sea. The water is interrupting, but it is not threatening. The sandpiper takes for granted the shaking that the sea causes periodically. So the sandpiper is not feeling threatened. D, is the sea the source of life to the sandpiper? Perhaps de facto it is a source of life, but this is not what the poem is talking about. So A is out, D is out. This leaves us with untroubling and distracting. If we look closely, how distracted is the sandpiper really by the sea? We see that he runs straight through it. He is unfazed. He is in a panic about something else, a controlled panic, mind you. But the sea doesn't really come into the way he is feeling. So untroubling is the closest description of the relationship that the sandpiper has to the sea. Question 23 asks us how the sandpiper first appears to the speaker. Now, what is meant by speaker here? Well, the narrator, the observer, in this case quite impersonal observer, that is relating these impressions of the sandpiper and the sea. A and C are both options for which there simply isn't a lot of evidence. A symbolic figure, the connection between land and sea, or real and mythical worlds, there just isn't anything to suggest it. And by there isn't anything, I of course mean the first stanza, because that is where you would look to answer this question, because it says the sandpiper first appears. We are left with B and D. Distracted and disturbed by the surroundings is not really a good choice, because if you look at the poem closely, at stanza number 1 closely, you see that there isn't really any evidence that he is distracted or disturbed. You can see that the sandpiper is taking for granted the roaring of the sea that happens right next to him. So what he is doing is he runs and runs in a state of controlled panic. He does not make the impression of somebody who is distracted, even though the surroundings, i.e. the roaring, shaking sea, is potentially very distracting. What attracts the observer's, the speaker's attention is precisely how undistracted, how unfazed the sandpiper is by the sea. So disconcertingly unaware of these surroundings, D is exactly what we are looking for here. Question 24 is a question about poetic devices, which can be tricky because it can seem so subjective. So let's keep our cool and go through the options one by one, and we will see how we can arrive calmly at the correct option here. The sandpiper is in a state of controlled panic. What is it in the form, not in the content, but the form of the poem, that reinforces this effect of controlled panic? Is it the regular rhyme of the second and fourth lines of each stanza? Perhaps this is more a reinforcement of control and not reinforcement of panic. So it only really fits half of the description. Images of the sea's magnitude, does that reinforce controlled panic? Well, as we saw in the previous questions, the controlled panic does not have anything to do with the sea. It has to do with something else, and we'll get on to that. But the images of the sea actually have very little to do with how the sandpiper is feeling, because the sandpiper is undistracted, unfazed by this big, roaring, shaking sea. The effect of uncertainty in lines 8 and 9, as D would suggest, well, it does not convey uncertainty, it conveys clarification. Watching his toes, or rather, watching the spaces between his toes, which leaves us with C, the repetition of he runs, and something, something, something. And that fits both the controlled aspect and the panicked aspect, because the sandpiper is nothing if not persistent. He is very determined, he is very focused on something, and the repetition of runs, or something, something, something conveys the repeated actions and the single-minded focus with which he performs the actions. Question 25, the one that asks us about the meaning of the allusion to the poet Blake, is worth looking at in more detail. It is a hard question, first of all, because it scares you. What if you don't know closely the works of the poet Blake? Well, remember that in the GAMSAT, you are not required to have that kind of real-world knowledge in order to be able to answer these questions correctly. It is still a reasoning question, and we are going to look at how we can discard the options one by one until we arrive at the correct option through reasoning. It does not matter who the poet Blake was and why Elizabeth Bishop makes an allusion, i.e. a reference, to him. All that matters is the four options we've got in front of us and the information we can use in the poem itself that will tell us which option is the correct one. Does it seem to be suggesting A, that the poetic spirit is an engulfing power? Now, the engulfing power for the sandpiper here is hunger. He is looking for food. So the opposite is true. Does it seem to be suggesting that the great artist had a capacity to be uniquely inspired by nature? It may or may not be true that Blake had the capacity to be uniquely inspired by nature. We don't know that, and it doesn't matter. What does matter, and what we can see clearly in the poem, is that Elizabeth Bishop is suggesting in a tongue-in-cheek manner it is the sandpiper who is inspired by Blake, not vice versa. The sandpiper is a student of Blake, not vice versa. Therefore, this option will not do. Is it suggesting that great genius becomes petty and crazy in a lesser incarnation? Now, this would suggest that Elizabeth Bishop is saying that the sandpiper is a lesser incarnation of the poet. That is misinterpreting the relationship that she is claiming between Blake and the sandpiper. She is saying that the sandpiper imitates Blake in some way, not that the sandpiper is Blake in any way. So therefore, that leaves us with B, an association between creative intensity and obsessiveness. And if I were you, I wouldn't dwell too much on what exactly that means, because you know that the other options are no good. You also know that the sandpiper is intense and obsessed with something. In fact, she actually says he is obsessed later on in the poem. So that is your only plausible option. And you see how we got there? Just by using our wits, by using our reasoning powers. We do not need to know anything about Blake's life or anything about why exactly Elizabeth Bishop is referring to Blake and not to any other poet. Now, every poet has their favorite themes and their favorite poetic devices that give their poetry its distinctive character. And that is what question 26 is asking us about. It is giving us a few options of the themes present in Elizabeth Bishop's poetry, and it's asking us which theme does this poem, Sandpiper, best exemplify. Let's look at these, and we will start from the bottom. Perspectives of time dwarfing the merely human. There is not enough evidence. Time is simply not a theme in this poem. C. Frailty of a human observer. Now, we know that obviously a priori there is a human observer that is recounting the scene, that is observing the sandpiper. However, this observer is present only as a perfunctory figure because somebody needs to be doing the writing. The sandpiper couldn't do it by himself, so there isn't really anything about the observer there. The observer is out of focus. The focus is entirely on the bird and the scene. B, the engulfing power of the world. This is a kind of red herring because there are elements in this poem of things that are powerful and things that are engulfing. So it sounds right, but the power of the world, what is it even saying? It's very vague. However, if we look at A, shifts of physical scale, we can see very precise evidence of how Elizabeth Bishop plays with shifts of physical scale in that poem to some very interesting effects. In the second line of the third stanza, no detail is too small for the sandpiper, and yet straight away it is paired with the Atlantic drains rapidly backwards and downwards. So there is a juxtaposition of the space between the sandpiper's feet, so a tiny scale, very zoomed in, if you will, with the movements of the Atlantic Ocean, something huge. This is a juxtaposition of scale. The scale shifts from minute to macro. Another instance of this is in the next stanza, in the fourth stanza, where there is a contradiction. And then the world is minute and vast and clear. How can the world be minute and vast at the same time? Bishop is taking poetic license here to describe it as minute and vast in the same sentence, to bring into the foreground that shift of scale, the juxtaposition that she is playing with in this poem.